Brilliant. Okay, just going through my list.
So what's your first question then, Chris, so we can get our brains in gear?
Yeah, I will be. So what will happen is I'm gonna just sort of say hi to everyone. This is one of the first panels of the day. I'll say all the kind of SPA stuff that I need to say, and then I'll go through and I'll read through your bios on just a little bit about you, and then I'll whack off with the first question. I'm just scrolling down on my script. The first question is going to be, you all studied sciences at university, but did you always want to become a science journalist, and why? And I'll start off with Roger, and then I'll go to Ange, and then Dalmeet. And then after that, it'll just be similar questions. I'll come to each of you just so it's a bit easier. And if you mute yourselves when you're not talking and then unmute, that'll just make it easier so that background noise and cars and stuff like that.
So quite similar to last year's then in that case. Yeah,
really similar. And then at the end, we'll have some questions at the end from audience members. And if not, I've got lots of more questions. So that's all good. Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Brilliant.
Yeah, the meeting's good. One of our neighbours is having their tree chopped down this morning. Wow. So we've got a lovely chainsaw action going on next door. Perfect timing.
Oh no.
Dear me. Well, hopefully it's a pretty awful day here. So hopefully the rest of the country is raining and people will be inside and watching us instead.
It hasn't stopped the chainsaws.
Not something I thought I'd be hearing this morning. Right. Okay, I'm going to start letting people in. Oh wait, I'll wait. 12. I'm a bit jumping the gun a bit. Can't. 11. Sorry.
That's all right.
So do you
part of it.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Do you anticipate that the people tuning into this panel want to become science journalists professionally?
I think so. I mean, some people might just be interested, thinking about it, deciding whether they want to go into that or another niche or just be journalists generally. But yeah, I anticipate most will be science or sort of student science journalists already or wanting to go into science journalism. Or just interested, in you. Yeah, but it'll all be students. Yeah, all students. Okay, right, it's 11. I'm gonna make sure I'm there on my little low list, and I'm gonna start letting people in. I see how. Oh, where have they gone? Okay. Give me a second. The person that was here has now gone, and I'm just gonna give them a few more minutes. I'm gonna check with my tech person. So great to have a tech person to do all this.
My nephew, 9-year-old nephew. Literally does all my tech for me, like.
Right.
So many different group chats. It's incredible. Right, I'll give people a few more minutes. It may be that they've sort of come in a few minutes early and then gone out, and then they'll come back in a sec. But if not, I mean, it doesn't matter too much if people aren't actually here on the live stream because it goes up online. And we usually kind of like catch up. We do better online afterwards anyway. But 11 should be early enough, late enough for students, really. They should be out of bed by now. So, great. Brilliant. Lovely. Great. I'm going to put it on speaker view, and we're going to kick off. Righty ho. Right. So, hello and welcome to the SPA National Conference, or SPANC 21. It's lovely to see you all here. I'm just switching to speaker view. There we go. And my name is Chris Matthews. I'm the London SPA Regional Officer, and I'll be chairing this panel on science journalism. Thank you to everyone for joining us this weekend. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We'll have a conversation around the subject, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Just so everyone is aware, the panel is being recorded as well as live streamed. So if you don't want to be seen, turn your cameras off. And I'm just going to hide on video, and there we all are. Brilliant. So Ahula is the science columnist for the Financial Times and a freelance writer, and is currently on book leave. Before that, she was a staff columnist and feature writer at the Times. She is a trustee of Sense About Science, which champions the use of evidence in policymaking and in public life. She is on the roster of Speaker for Schools, which provides free career and motivational talks to state school pupils. She was educated at a comprehensive school in Essex. She trained as a physicist at Imperial College London, has a postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism from City University, which was thanks to a bursary from the Scott Trust. Roger Highfield is the science director at the Science Museum Group. He studied chemistry at the University of Oxford and was the first person to bounce a neutron off a soap bubble. Roger was the science editor of the Daily Telegraph for 2 decades and the editor of New Scientist between 2008 and 2011. He is a member of the Medical Research Council, a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a visiting professor at UCL and Oxford. And finally, Dalmeet Singh Chawla is an award-winning freelance science journalist based in London. He has a biochemistry BSc from UCL, a science communication MSc from Imperial, and a passion for neat storytelling. In 2020, he received the Excellence in Statistical Reporting Award from the American Statistical Association. So welcome to you all, and welcome to our audience. First of all, I'm going to kick off things with a question to all three of you. You all studied sciences at university, but did you always want to become science journalists, and why? Roger, do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess it's kind of a complicated story. Margaret Thatcher and Chernobyl play a key role in my story getting to Fleet Street. I mean, I was a bit, when I was studying chemistry at Oxford, I was really interested in the student newspaper, but I found the people on it kind of intimidating and very cool people. And I had to wait until my doctorate when I was so bored with kind of writing software and waiting for data that wasn't there. I did join the university paper. And then Thatcher enters the story because when I finished my doctorate, there really weren't many opportunities in academia at that time. And my supervisor said, look, why not try and become a journalist? And if it doesn't work out, you can do a postdoc, So he sort of encouraged me to give it a shot. And then Chernobyl enters the story because I was working on a nuclear magazine, trying to get into a Swedish nuclear plant with a bunch of Scandinavian journalists when all the alarms went off. And actually, that was the first the Western world knew about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. So I found myself, I think I was the first British hack to know about the accident. It took several days for the Soviet Union to own up to it. And actually at that time, Fleet Street had a huge appetite for nuclear literate journalists. I'm talking about 86. And so that helped me get into the Daily Telegraph. So that sort of in a nutshell is it. You need a bit of interest and a lot of luck, I think.
Brilliant, thanks. Ange, how about you?
I tell you what, could you go to Dalmeet, because with the chainsaws have started. So, and I'll come back afterwards, just in case. Hopefully, we get a gap in the tree cutting. Is that all right?
Yeah. Dalmeet, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So, no, I didn't know I was always going to be a science journalist. So, at UCL, when I was doing my biochemistry degree, until the 3rd year, I was kind of under the illusion that I wanted to go into medicine and become a doctor, until I actually shadowed, a doctor at a GP practice and realized, that's not what I wanted to do. And then that begged the question, what did I want to do? And eventually a new course popped up on the 3rd year of my undergraduate called Biosciences in Business and Media. And one of my friends encouraged me to try it out, even though it seemed odd to me. So I went along and I tried it out, and it clicked straight away. Oh, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to communicate science to an audience. But at that point, I didn't know whether I wanted to go into TV, radio, or writing or policy communications and that sort of thing. Which sort of area basically of science communication did I want to do? So in that, but I had made up my mind that I wanted to go into some sort of science communication. So that's why I went on to do a master's at Imperial in science communication, and the kind of narrowed down from there. I tried each one of those things when I was there. I did my master's part-time, and during the summer, I would still go in during the holidays, and and try and I'll just take their camera all the way to Birmingham to shoot a video in the zoo, just to try out different things. What exactly did I want to do? Did lots of internships when I was there, 4 different internships. The lecturers there had really good contacts, so they were able to kind of hook me up with different internships. So try different things out, and in the end, I preferred writing the most, so I kind of went into that basically.
Brilliant, thanks. And Ange, how are the chainsaws doing?
Right, the chainsaws are still going. So what I'll do is can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly, actually.
Great, actually. Okay, that's great. What I might try to do is move room. But no, I didn't always want to be a science journalist. I think I've sort of iterated towards it during my career. I started off as a scientist, and I mean, to be honest, I've always loved writing, and I've always loved reading and books, and just something about words do it for me. So in fact, before I took my degree, I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to do something like English literature, or I ended up doing physics because that's the A-levels I had to do. But then when I was doing my PhD, I started freelancing. I entered the Daily Telegraph science competition. Thank you, Roger. And decided that actually my future and my skills and my personality was not really stuck in a research lab somewhere in an office doing computer modelling or the things that I was doing at the time. But actually I was always out and about, and I wanted to talk to other people about their research. And I wanted to kind of understand it for myself. So I'm a bit of a magpie in that sense. And rather than doing the same bit of research for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, I could write about something different every week. And that was really joyful. It was lovely. So, but I think the important thing for me was that when I decided to do it, I thought I have to go for it, and I have to learn the craft of journalism. And that, I think I really would recommend that if you're serious about being a journalism, before you become a specialist, is maybe trying to get onto a general journalism course. And so I did the postgrad city course. You learn news values, you learn how to be a hack. And obviously, I wanted a job in national newspapers, and you have to work all over the place. I ended up at the Times as a trainee. I worked for 6 months on home news, 6 months on foreign news, and I learned the skills that I needed to decide what I to operate in a newsroom, which is what people are looking for. They're looking for professionals that don't have news values, that know how to find a story, know what to do, know how not to be libeled, that sort of thing. So and then as I think that's when I joined the Times. At the time they were introducing a science page and a health page, and they didn't have any specialist writers. And I became the sort of resident specialist writer, and that was brilliant for me. So and then it was all it was all upwards from there, and I've had a great career. I really enjoy it. It's become ever more important. I think last year, 2020, as I'm sure everyone would agree, was the most important year of my professional and personal life, really, with the pandemic. And I kind of felt it was what everything was leading up to, and it was using all the skills that I'd acquired over kind of a 25-year career. But I've loved it. I really enjoy it. But it's hard work. It takes dedication. You have to be interested in it. So if you're going to specialize in something, just make sure you're living interested, because you need to do a lot of reading, you need to be ahead of your peers, and you need to know where the story is. But again, those are essential news skills. I've never looked back, but it is hard work, and it's worth training properly if you want to do it.
Brilliant, thanks. And just on, you mentioned specialism and niche, and I was wondering if any of you have ever thought about switching on niche, or do you think it's important to stick with one? Dalmeet, as you're a freelancer, shall we start with you?
Sure, yeah, I have quite a strong opinion on this one. So I think it's quite important for journalists to develop a niche, so even within the sciences. So for example, my niche happens to be science publishing and research misconduct, peer review, the reproducibility, kind of the inner workings of science. The meta science, you can say, and not a lot of people do that. So that in that way, if you develop a niche, what tends to happen is editors start coming to you. So as a freelancer, it's quite important, you become the go-to person for a certain topic. It doesn't have to be that, could be neuroscience, could be, I don't know, archaeology or whatever, but you could become the go-to person for those type of stories. So as soon as this editor see that sort of story, if they've got a working relationship with you over the years that you've been sending the pitches for X amount of time, and then they start throwing stories out to you as well, in appreciation of you, obviously, giving them good stories and that sort of thing as well. So it's a two-way thing. I do think journalists, especially for freelancers, it's quite important to develop a niche and pick one thing and basically report the hell out of it. So some journalists and disagree and say if what tends to happen if one big story comes, such as COVID, is the generalists are the ones who are able to kind of cover anything and kind of are on the radar, and that's agreed. That's true to some extent. So when the pandemic came along, early last year, some of my stories, they were on the kind of lower priority list for editors, and COVID certainly was just everywhere. So I also started covering COVID here and there, but other people who were more general journalists, who had a science beat but tend to cover more broad range of topics, were on the higher list for some editors, and some editors were obviously going to the people who had infectious diseases specialties and that sort of thing. So it's quite important to pick a niche, and then you can slowly broaden out different topics. So I also write sometimes psychology and genetic stories and so on, but I have to have my bread and butter basically in order to kind of go on to the next stage.
Brilliant. And Roger, as an editor, I'm assuming you had to have quite a broad range of looking into different areas of science. But as a reporter, did you start out as Dalmeet was saying?
Yeah, I mean,
specialist niche.
I mean, I was like, it depends what you mean by the word niche, because I was very lucky because my first job was working for a magazine called Pulse, which is not about eating vegetables or soft pornography. It's a GP's magazine, and actually you found yourself in big press conferences next to national journalists trying to get a specific angle on a story that had to keep for a few days, and these were often political stories, and you suddenly sort of thought, gosh, actually it's easy to be a national journalist because they just go for the really obvious angle. I've got to kill myself to find an angle, and I think that was a really good training. When you say niche, I mean, when I joined the Telegraph, they basically threw me at any story they didn't understand. So for some reason, there were lots of disasters. The King's Cross fire. I happened to be going down the escalator when it was on fire and thought, what's that funny smell? And then when I got home, the whole thing blew up. And they used me, and I got in a lot of trouble with the government minister talking about the filth underneath escalators and so on. It turned out to be right. The M1 crash. Why did that happen? The Herald of Free Enterprise. They, if a Russian nuclear sub went down for unexplained reasons, I was expected to write 500 words on what could have gone wrong. So when you say niche, it was a pretty gigantic niche, and you very quickly got a bit of expertise in a lot of fields.
Brilliant. Wow. And Ange, how about you? What are your thoughts?
I mean, your initial question was, should people swap niches? My feeling about that is I wouldn't now. I mean, funny enough, when I started in journalism, I actually wanted to be a lobby correspondent. So I wanted to be a political journalist. And I kind of, but I ended up writing the stuff I knew. And part of it, actually, I agree with Roger. It's funny to hear Dalmeet talk about niche as psychology or neuroscience and so on. that covers my whole beat at the FT. So absolutely everything that people don't understand or that has anything to do with the scientific paper, that will be my brief, and that's fair game for me. I think in terms of how niche do you get, well, the thing is that you're there to be the writer, you're there to be the readers or the viewers or the listeners' eyes and ears on the science world and pick out the signal among the noise. So in terms of niche, I'm quite picky about what I do. I don't write very much, but they're meant to be, it's the one story you need to be reading about as an FT reader that week. So and my niche is slightly different because I'm an opinion writer, so I'm a comment columnist. So it might be making a judgment. It's about making it's about telling someone why they really ought to listen to this story about the rare earth metals being in short supply, or what Elon Musk is doing in space, and what's the future of commercial space, and have states come out of it and the geopolitics of that, and it's all about it's about, in order to make those judgments, you need to build up a kind of a back catalogue in a way of contacts, work, and so that you're fairly confident that you're making a good judgment call. And I think it's quite hard to swap niches about. I mean, I think that's the sort of thing that would be really good for a person at the beginning of their career to do. And I would really advise that. So if you're going into a general, maybe a general news site or something like that, swap niches around, try new things out. But actually newspapers are very good at trying people out in different places. So they'll give you 6 months on this place, 6 months on that. And normally it gives people a chance to shine and find what their niche is. That all the political correspondents and editors I know are absolutely passionate about politics. They live it, they breathe it. And in some senses, I'm the same with science. I want to be reading about, the first thing I do in the morning is pick up my phone and look at what Science Twitter is saying, or what the new preprints are, or though I'm naturally interested in it. And if you're naturally interested in it, you will sort of develop your expertise. You will become that go-to person, as Dalmeet says. And so I think once you get to a certain stage in your career, it's quite hard to swap. And you're then competing against people that do have that bigger back catalogue than you have. And I think actually the passion comes through. I'm really passionate about what I do, and about what I'm here to do, which is kind of to be an interface to make sense of science for people, to explain why it matters, maybe explain why things don't matter, and to help them sort of, certainly for the last year, help them think their way through the pandemic.
Brilliant, thanks. Dalmeet, I'm going to come to you. What do you wish you had known about the industry when you started out?
So, I think the industry is very competitive, in terms of, you can say staff reporting jobs and that sort of thing. So, I think in terms of the actual industry, I would have liked to know kind of how to approach editors, how to pitch them, what the actual process was. So during the masters, we were at Imperial, which I highly recommend to anyone, by the way. It was brilliant. We learned a number of things, but the actual writing and the actual pitching, I don't think I could learn anywhere apart from actually just doing it. So when I was initially pitching editors, it's important to understand that each publication has a different audience and different type of audience, and that sort of thing, which is which you don't think as a student. You just think, oh, I want to write about this, I want to write about this, but you don't think, who am I writing to? Who are the readers? What should I be considering when I should be pitching a story? So having that sort of background knowledge of how to approach editors, how to talk to them about different stories, and which type of story would be suitable to which type of editor would have been really handy. Also, what type of pay rates and that sort of thing. So once you start out, you don't really know where to go. And, now I have a pretty good idea which story to sell off where to make the most amount of money, basically, which is a very, as a freelancer, it's very important because, obviously you want to sell off your publication, you're putting your time into this. And also, I wish I had known about the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, ALCS, which I recommend to anyone who's writing anything for a British publication, whether they're an academic or a journalist or a writer or an author. If they sign up to that, they will be due some sort of royalties. If they, as long as it's not in newspapers, it's in magazines and that sort of thing, which I write for. You automatically get royalties every year if you kind of log your articles into there. So I wish these are the two main things that I think I would have really benefited from at the time.
Brilliant. Roger, I'm going to come to you. What do you wish?
Yeah, I totally agree with Dalmeet. I mean, understanding your audience is central. And I think when I went into Fleet Street, I was suffering from explainitis. And thank goodness I had a really affable news editor who used to listen to me rambling on, trying to explain why something was important. And it took me several years to hone the art of the pitch. In fact, my favorite pitch, I managed to get half a page of the Daily Telegraph with 2 words. So, you've got to imagine the news editor's looking at 2 or 3 screens of stuff, with scrolling news stories. They're getting, you've got to win this sort of Darwinian battle for space in the paper. So I went up to the news editor and just said penguin prostitution. And I can't remember if it was he or she. They said, okay, half a page, page 3, that sounds great. Didn't have to explain anything. And actually, the key is not to say something interesting, it's to say something intriguing. So you kind of learn the art of the pitch, and it's incredibly important to get that cut through so you understand your audience and you understand the most efficient way to connect with them, because ultimately it's about getting eyeballs.
Brilliant. And Ange, how about you?
Yeah, sort of what I wish I'd known. Well, actually, it's like, because I went on the City course, we were really well trained. Actually, we were really good. And then other than that, it's experience. And I think it is understanding your audience. One thing that used to really baffle me is why freelance writers would contact me when I was on features and try to pitch a piece that we ran the week before. Why? I mean, read your outlet, know the people you're pitching to. What kind of pieces do they want, and also what new can you bring to it? I mean, I think it's really important that you don't take your consumers, whether they're readers, viewers, listeners, for granted. No one's kind of sitting there with a gun to your reader's head, making them read your stuff. That you have the privilege of having their time, and it's about earning it. And make them glad when they've got to the end of your column that they've spent those 5 minutes with you, and not perhaps scrolling on their phone making a coffee or whatever. So I think you're always having that uppermost in your mind, and always trying to be in your reader's shoes, but also in your editor's shoes. So I used to do a fair bit of editing when I was on T2, the features bit, particularly for the specialists, but actually I did all sorts of things, serials and excerpts and rights and things like that. But the one of the things that I remember being really important, and that doesn't get said enough, I think, is being professional. So if you pitch something, deliver on time, deliver to length, deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And I would much rather have a writer and go back to a writer that maybe it wasn't the most scintillating copy in the world, but it did what it said on the tin. I as an editor knew that I could work on it. I would much rather have a writer like that than somebody who's absolutely brilliant, but I wasn't sure if they were going to deliver to my deadline. So it's about being professional. I think that's really, really important. It can't be underestimated. And remember, your reputation goes with you everywhere. So editors talk to each other. You are as good as your pieces. And as Dalmeet said, if you are good, and if you become a specialist and you know what you're doing and you know how to pitch, people will start coming back to you. So and people will come back to you because they know they can rely on you. So just that being reliable, knowing, being very just someone that's pleasant to work with, all the sort of things that get overlooked, I think, sometimes in journalism. But people are choosing to work with you as a person as well as a writer, someone that they can do business with. And so developing that professional approach is really useful.
Brilliant. And I feel I'm going to ask the sort of elephant in the room. COVID, the pandemic, how has that changed your job? Dalmeet, should we start with you?
So yeah, at the start, I was, a few of my stories, quite a few of my stories were kind of pushed back to the backbench. And basically, for the first few weeks, I didn't have any stories because all my all the topics I was writing about, they became kind of second priority. But then I started doing research into COVID and writing a little bit about COVID. So mostly I used to work from home anyway. Used to work at cafes sometimes here and there. So that obviously that got cut back and just started working from home. In terms of actual freelance, yeah, freelance work and became more competitive. I think outlets, some of the outlets at least that I work for, they did cut some work back, but that kind of gave me an opportunity to reach out to new editors and kind of work with new publications. So overall, I think I was less impacted than a lot of other people in terms of staff reporters and whose jobs were cut for some reason, or due to lack of funding or whatever. So I was quite fortunate in that sense. I've just continued doing what I've been doing. Basically, some of my stories, like I said, were pushed back, but that's fine. They were just published later or whatnot. And some of the outlets, they had less to go on. So I started working with a few other outlets and that sort of thing. So all in all, it wasn't that much of a change for me, just because of the beat that I work on and and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of other journalists were science journalists were covering COVID a lot more, and some some call themselves COVID correspondents now. So there you go.
Yeah, and Ange, how was it being? I mean, I'm guessing you had to move out of the newsroom. How was that?
When you say move out, I don't work in the newsroom, so I work from home. I'm a contract columnist for the FT, and I wrote probably one of the first pieces in the British press about this new pneumonia that was appearing in Wuhan. And I remember on the sort of 6th or 7th of Jan, just going to my editors and saying, look, I really don't like the look of this. I think this should be my first column of the year. And so I wrote about it. And of course, that kind of set the tone for the whole year. And it was, when I talked earlier about that back catalogue, I think that's the year 2020 was where the back catalogue came into its own, because I felt as if I was right at the edge of my expertise, because you had this phenomenal kind of world crisis brewing, sort of, first of all, it was distinct stages. So in sort of January and February, I think I did about two or three pieces about it, because I really didn't like the look of it. And so that was where I was making a judgment about what I thought about it. And that was quite hard to do, because quite a lot of newspapers weren't really doing anything, didn't really think it was anything worth covering, which is fair enough, because there are lots of other things to cover. But I was kind of going out on a limb a little bit. And then, of course, in February, in the early part of the year, there was just this explosion of clinical and scientific information about this brand new disease. And you had papers pouring in from all over the world, but often from China, Hong Kong, that part of the world, just the volume of stuff. And, when I was talking earlier about trying to be the signal among the noise, I remember feeling extremely stressed and waking up in the night thinking, oh my God, that there are papers being published right now that I haven't seen. And when I woke up in the morning, there was just tons of stuff to look through. And so I felt, and that's when, your skills as a news journalist really come to the fore. What is the new thing here? What is the thing, the really big story about this pandemic, or this outbreak as it was then, that's not being reported? And so keeping on top of that was really difficult. And I think there was an additional side of it, which is, of course, then it affects your personal life. So my husband and I are working at home. My daughter had just started university. My son was at home, but she was back home. And you suddenly realise that this thing that you've written about perhaps on and off for 20 years is finally happening. So you're kind of trying to grasp with the psychological kind of mind screwing of that. as well as trying to be on top of your game professionally. So, but in terms of me, I don't think I think I wrote maybe 2 pieces the entire year that was not about the pandemic. But I also felt that I had to step up to offer that specialism at the FT, and eventually they did appoint a news coronavirus correspondent. So I was working quite heavily with Clive Cookson. You know, it was continual sort of trying to work out what the coverage should be, where could I make a difference, and also doing other things like sort of writing features and writing, you know, sort of for the magazine, other columns. There was a lot of work, and there was a lot of there was a lot of work involved trying to find out what the best pieces were to write. But for me, I mean, I really would be quite happy never to write about SARS-CoV-2 again.
Fair enough. Roger, I'm going to come to you. Do you think COVID will or already has created a boom in science journalism and just in science generally?
I think it's shown, actually. I think the UK's got a very competitive press and got a very good science press, and you know, okay, with some exceptions, but you know, I've been impressed, and I have to say, it turned me back into a journalist, bizarrely. You know, like Ange, I'd written about the risk of pandemics for decades. And maybe the biggest health scare I was involved with was when there was a link between BSE and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and that caused really a national panic. There was a fear that there'd be like a dementia epidemic. And that was the last time when really you could write whole pages on prions, and news editors would gratefully put them straight in the newspaper because people wanted to understand what was going on. And strangely enough, something similar happened, you know, with me in COVID, because I wrote a long form Q&A because I found that colleagues were endlessly, you know, well, they just didn't know what the hell was going on. And we had a dwell time of half an hour, more than half an hour on this. People were not only clicking on it, they were reading it in great detail. And in fact, I've written more than 30 of these long form Q&A things, 120,000 words over the last year. And in fact, I just did one this week with an interview with one of the bosses of the Serum Institute of India, and also a follow-up to an mass intelligence or cognitive test I'd done years ago at New Scientist, showing the long-term effects of long COVID on cognition. So weirdly, it turned me back into a journalist. And I think we're lucky to have you know, a very sort of muscular, popular science press in the UK. They could do my only moan would be there seems to be less feature space and dedicated science pages now than a few years ago, but you know, that doesn't matter in a national crisis like that. They were given tons of space, and you know, I've been really impressed.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a different question now. You made the switch from journalism because you're now the science director at the Science Museum Group. When did you make that change, and how and why did you go about doing it?
Yeah, it's well, I have to say that I was kind of headhunted, and I was so, like, I'd never thought about working for a museum at all. I just initially said no because, you know, I was editing New Scientist. That was a pretty cool thing to do. But then I talked to them again, and I found that I could slightly mold the job. So I was very lucky that I negotiated a 4-day week. I put in a crazy demand, which I thought they'd ignore, but in fact they took seriously. I wanted a treadmill desk because I'd done this mad experiment, the Daily Telegraph, where I was mocked by the entire staff for 3 months working on a treadmill desk, but I felt so much better. So I said, can I have a treadmill desk? It was my treadmill, I hasten to add, but I now have a treadmill desk. And I found museums actually very interesting kind of nexus between you know, science, history, the charity sector, government, and so on, big audiences. So it's enough in common with what I used to do in my old life not to feel completely seasick, but it was new enough to sort of give me a new lease of life. And actually, I can't believe I've been there for 10 years, you know, so, and I still do the odd bit of freelancing for people like Wired or Chemistry World. So, you know, I'm still, and the odd book as well. So I haven't completely abandoned being a wordsmith.
Brilliant. Right, now I'm going to open up the conversation to everyone watching on Zoom at home. So you can raise your hand digitally on Zoom or put a question in the chat and we'll read it out. So if anyone's got one, do it now. If not, I will. I've got some questions of my own, so I will give everyone a little time to think of some. Ange, you're on book leave at the moment. What are you working on?
Well, it's going to be publicized next week. So, but yeah, it's pandemic related, and yeah, it's been great. It's yeah, I've taken some time off to do it properly because it's, you know, as I said, there was so much that happened last year, and I felt like I needed to just immerse myself in the material before, you know, before kind of to do it properly, really. But one thing I would say, yeah, it's a great time to be a science journalist because I wish I'd had 2 more of me last year to get through all the work I was offered, because I had to turn stuff down. And what amazes me, and actually I feel really privileged to be in this position, is that I cannot believe that I am still you know, earning a living writing as a science writer, because there are so many science communication courses, and there are, you know, as Roger says, you know, there aren't dedicated science pages, many of them anymore. And I think it shows that if you can build up a niche and you can have a voice, there are great careers to be had out there, and I think the pandemic will have just reinforced that idea that people really, there is an appetite for understanding this stuff because it is part of our world and it's going to be increasingly so. If you think about the big challenges like water scarcity, climate change, energy, all of those are really grounded in science and engineering. They are, you know, and they are technical, but they're cultural. And I think it really, that the more people that can get involved and become specialists and can you know, interpret what's going on in those really big important issues, I think will be very coveted. Actually, they will have there'll be a longevity about their careers and so on. I think they'll be sought after people.
Brilliant. Right, we've got a question from Charlie Hancock, so I've asked him to mute. Charlie, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I apologise if this question isn't relevant or has already been answered because I've only just managed to get into the call. How have you found that the pandemic has changed your relationship as a science journalist with journalists on other beats, particularly politics, or editors as well?
Shall I? Well, that's really interesting because I mean, politics has always been part of my beat, as it were, being a commentator. But it does. I mean, I talk to the political team of the FT a fair bit because of Sage. So you know that. I mean, this has been a really fascinating time actually to look at how science policy is fed into Number 10 and what comes out of the other side. So in terms of, I mean, I think science has always been political. So all the big science issues are political in a way. I mean, you think about the gene editing of humans, climate change, they are all big challenges to the way we think about ourselves and our societies and our culture, our countries, our economies. So I think that's always in the back of my mind. I suppose it's been more explicit this time. So, you know, with the idea of the government following the science and so on, it has, you know, really brought science and politics head to head. But I think a good science journalist should always have that as one of their considerations when they're doing a story.
Brilliant.
Actually, Charlie, you've kind of reminded me, although I'm not really a day-to-day hack anymore, but at the start of the pandemic with the Number 10 briefings, I got really frustrated that it was the lobby correspondents asking the questions because they're not bloody good at doing it. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't ask good questions. You know, there are some well-known political columnists who really were hopeless at trying to get to the bottom of what was going on. And I thought, why didn't they put the science pack in those number 10 briefings and kick the lobby guys out. But there's this very slightly wrong, cozy relationship between the lobby and number 10. And it's a shame we couldn't have, you know, got the right journalists in the right place at the right time. There we are. I'll stop pontificating now.
You're absolutely right, Roger.
Yeah, 100% agree with Roger. Like, that was exactly the thing that was going through my brain, you know, especially seeing lots of, you know, irrelevant questions being asked, or questions that weren't the most important questions at the time, you know, and reports like, you know, Robert Peston's herd immunity report in the Spectator without any comments from actual scientists and that sort of thing. It was really frustrating. And eventually what happened, if you watched it closely, is, you know, a new scientist reporter was added to kind of ask questions. And you know, what started happening is actual questions that I had started being answered. And I was like, finally, there's some, you know, relevant information coming from these kind of briefings. So there you go.
You.
Brilliant. I'm going to move on to a question from Kieran Graves. So this is for everyone, but leading on from Andrew's point about general reporting versus specialism. How can someone go about building a specialism if they don't have any specific training or experience in an area? Dalmeet, should we start with you?
It's a good question. So, you know, for me personally, I'd kind of share my background. So I used to work in science publishing. I used to work for a science publisher, Biomed Central. You know, so when I started actually doing freelance in 2014, when I was doing my master's, so my lecturer told me, just try it out, see what happens. You know, you've got some time now, you're financially stable, you haven't got many commitments in you know, in that sense, try out freelancing. I was like, great. The first thing I started writing about is science publishing because I knew that area. So I think if you've worked in an area, it's quite interesting, or if you've done research in a certain area, perhaps start out with that, because that's kind of your comfort zone, and then you can kind of build out from there. So I'm still kind of exploring new areas now. You know, I'm still relatively new to this area of, you know, 5-6 years experience, but you know, I've kind of slowly branched out and you know, started to explore other areas as well. So I think a lot of it comes down to reading, and actually, because you know, you want to know what else is being covered in that area before you start thinking what's novel. You know, now in my specific beat, if I look at a paper, or if I look at a story, if I look at a Twitter thread, I can tell straight away whether something's novel or not, because I know what's been covered in that area for that amount of time. But if I did the same for, I don't know, something to do with AI, for instance, I wouldn't, or space, I wouldn't know if it's novel or what's been reported in that area, for example. So I you know, a lot of it comes down to reading, and a lot of it comes down to your contacts and what they tell you. But honestly, you know, building a network of scientists and sources, you know, and just getting them to update you, you know, when new things happen in their area is actually quite a handy thing to do. So often I just get sources who just you know, write to me saying, hey, you know, this is a new thing in this area, not many people have written about it, you should look into this. I've enjoyed your previous stories on X, Y, and Z. This is an area that might be of interest to you. And that's a good way to branch out, because you know, they are experts in that field. They have a close eye on things, and whereas you might not have been. So I think suggestions from people, reading around, and just talking to like lots of different people, building a network of sources is a really handy approach.
Brilliant. And Andrew, I'm going to come to you with a different question we've got from Matthew Bird. You spoke a little bit before about doing NCTJs or accredited qualifications. What are your thoughts on doing them? How necessary or useful is it to become a science journalist, to do one of those courses?
I mean, I mean, my information is probably really out of date, but I suppose for me, I worked backwards, and I thought, I want to be on a national newspaper. How do I get there? So for me, it was looking at how they recruited. So, and they tended to recruit from particular courses, journalism courses. So then the obvious next step was to try to get on one of those courses, which is what I did. So that was the first thing. Now, I don't know how they recruit now. I mean, you might want to go and have a look at, if you've got a news organisation in mind that you're interested in working for, they will have maybe a training scheme where you can look at the requirements. You know, it might be that some of them want accredited, you know, you to have done an NCTJ course. So it's worth looking at that. Some other places, I know that some of the newspapers that so I was in a class of about 30 people, and a few of the, it was all the newspapers, so the Sunday Times, not the Times actually at that time, although that changed, sort of the Independent, the Express, all of that. Some of them, what they did was they recruited first and then sent you on a course. But bear in mind, in order to get onto one of those, you might need a, what do you call it? You know, cuttings file. You might need evidence that you've done stuff and you've pitched stuff and you've got stuff published, or, you know, broadcast, or whatever, or you've got your own blog and that's well read. So a lot of it is working out where you want to be career-wise, and working out either how they recruit or working out how other people who work there got to where they are. So there's a real, so kind of do your homework. There are lots of different routes in. It used to be the case that that you could, you know, you had to have an NCTJ course to get on, or at least some kind of formal training. I don't think that's the case now, and you know, you get lots of writers that don't come in through that route, but most people are graduates. I think it's quite hard to come in if you don't have a degree, I think. Oh yeah, I mean, I really would, because as we've all said, I mean, I really do strongly believe it's a craft. You learn stuff, you learn how to pitch, you learn how to make contacts, you learn how to just write a story, and that's important whether you're working for online newspapers, where you're writing a script. So I work for Newsnight for, you know, I freelance for them for a bit. You're writing scripts, all of those, I think those are skills that actually is worth taking 6 months, 9 months, a year to learn properly, so that you hit the ground running if you do get an opportunity to go into a news organisation, and then maybe reach out to people that are doing the job that you want to do. How did they get there? What would their advice be? So it's about, you know, kind of being very practical about it and quite hard-headed, probably.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm afraid we've come to the end of the session. It's been a brilliant discussion, and thank you to all our panelists for sharing their experience and their views. And thanks to everyone watching at home as well. I hope you've enjoyed it, and feel free to tweet us at SPA Journalism on Twitter about how amazing this science journalism panel was. The freelance journalism panel is about to begin as well, and it's on this call. So if you're here for freelance, stay. We're about to get started too. Roger, Dalmeet, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Brilliant.